I'm just creating two quick videos, just some really key specific tips for your SACs. So, firstly, my cursor's not working. Firstly, you really need to hone in on the goals. Okay, it's really, really important that you know all three goals really well, and you can articulate exactly what they're trying to achieve. So, strong and sustainable growth, the fastest rate of growth measured in real GDP, consistent with strong employment growth, without causing excessive inflation, external environmental pressures. To be honest, I reckon this is the one that people are defining the best, and maybe because it's the longest and people know exactly what they need to say. The shorter ones, people aren't quite saying. So in price stability, an average increase in prices of 2 to 3% measured by headline or CPI inflation is the same thing, per year on average. These four words, make sure you include them in your definition. On average, an average increase in prices 2 to 3% per year on average over the course of the business cycle. Okay, which basically means that the average is 2 to 3% per year. It doesn't have to always be 2 to 3%, but the average over the business cycle, so an 8-year period, should be between 2 to 3%. And lastly, full employment, the lowest rate of unemployment without causing excessive inflation, that's there. That needs to be in your definition. Okay, I'm almost at the stage where if you don't include that, you're getting zero. You need to have no excessive inflation. No excessive inflation. That's the idea of full employment, that it's the lowest rate without excessive inflation. Generally considered to be 4 to 5% with no cyclical unemployment. Okay, those three definitions will help you to answer the rest of your answers in detail, properly, and it's really, really important. Some other tips, this whole SAC's about supply side policies. So when you're linking it to employment, basically, when you're thinking about these policies, there's kind of 2 or 3 things you can link to employment every time. So anything lowers cost of production, which basically all your supply side policies will eventually lower cost of production. That has 2 main benefits for employment. One, firms are more willing to supply because it costs them less. They're making more profit, so they're more willing to supply. And supply means they're producing more, and that means that they're supplying more, they're producing more, so they need more workers. And secondly, prices are lower, and therefore that creates jobs as well because people buy our stuff. So an increase in participation, for example, creates more jobs because not only is there lower wages because of more supply, it boosts productivity, so firms are more willing to supply, and therefore they hire more workers, and it boosts their international competitiveness. So there's kind of 3 reasons why any policy, if you're doing welfare reforms or tax reforms that boost participation, there's 3 links to employment. One, that they're more productive, so firms are more willing to supply because they've got lower cost of production. 2, they hire more workers because of this. And 3, it increases their international competitiveness. Okay, when you're linking things to inflation, most things are reducing cost-push inflation. It's generally due to increases in productivity or lower wages. It might be because of reduced congestion. So think of what your policy does and articulate really clearly why that leads to lower prices. It'll always be cost-push inflation that we're reducing because we're expanding our productive capacity and lowering cost of production, but provide detail as to why that's the case. And for strong and sustainable growth, basically you want to be linking it to why production increases. So generally that's because firms are more willing to supply. Supply side policies increase the quality and quantity of our resources, so people are more able to supply goods as well. And it leads to more jobs and less inflation. So all the other parts of that goal can be included there as well. Some key definitions, make sure you've got productive capacity down pat, because lots of questions about productive capacity. So it's the maximum output when we use all our resources to their full potential, is our productive capacity. Other things, an efficient allocation of resources is another important one, when we're allocating our resources in a way to maximise society's living standards and minimising opportunity cost. So, in terms of aims of supply-side policies, just going to quickly touch on a couple of things at the start of the chapter before we look into specific policies. Basically, you need to be aware of the key aims. So, fighting stagflation, basically monetary policy and the demand policies are not useful because if we're being expansionary, it'll lead to more inflation, so it won't help. And if we're contractionary, it leads to less growth. So we need supply-side policies. Alleviating capacity constraints or bottlenecks in the economy that prevent us from producing more. Addressing short-term supply shocks. It's when you're using things like subsidies to try and allow businesses to recover. And boosting our international competitiveness, so lower prices, which creates jobs as well. Or again, a definition of the types of efficiency. I'll send you these slides, but make sure you're aware of all of these. So allocative efficiency, achieving the most efficient allocation of resources so our living standards are maximised. Technical efficiency, minimising production costs, maximising productivity. Intertemporal efficiency, it's more your long-term sort of focus, so boosting intertemporal efficiency involves looking after the climate, looking after our savings, so it's very much a long-term focus. And dynamic efficiency is about how quickly we can respond to conditions. So any sort of education policies are great for dynamic efficiency because they allow us to respond to consumers' needs. Same with research and development, allows us to respond to the ever-changing needs of the society as well. Okay, so there's just some specific policies for each of the types of efficiency. Again, look through the slides to give yourself more detail about some of these. This is just any policy that's going to improve living standards, really. These are specifically resulting in increased productivity, so education, research and development. These ones are about making us more responsive to consumers' needs. And then these are future policies related to savings and the environment. Okay, here's two multiple choice questions. Which of the following recent supply side policy announcements will have an effect on the budget outcome that is different to the others? This is one of the ones people have been struggling with. The correct answer is C. And basically, if you look at the three policies, besides C, they're all likely to lead to a bigger budget deficit. So this one's spending more money. This one's giving out more subsidies, so both increasing expenditure. This one's reducing taxes, so it'll reduce revenue. All of those will lead to a bigger budget deficit. The third one, a reduction in subsidies, is the only one that is going to save the government money. So that'll lead to a smaller deficit or a bigger surplus. Which of the following measures is likely to contribute to is least likely to contribute to productive capacity in the long term? Okay, the correct answer is the one that's not going to boost efficiency in the long term, which is your provision of government subsidies to protect industries. They can embed inefficiencies, and the government's unlikely to do that, whereas the first three are all encouraging participation. So increasing funding for childcare is a welfare reform, trying to get more people into the workforce. Reduction in individual taxes is a tax reform to try and encourage participation. And funding for research and development should improve technology and infrastructure. Okay, before we get into the policies, last slide, aggregate demand versus aggregate supply policies. So aggregate demand policies, the key thing you want to say is that it's influence the level of spending in the economy. They're designed to try and regulate the business cycle and prevent peaks and troughs. They deal with cyclical problems. They're short-term in focus. Some of the key words you want to use. But mainly that they influence spending. They avoid peaks and troughs. Whereas supply-side policies, they work on the supply side. They try to increase either the quality or quantity of resources, boosting efficiency, boosting our ability to produce goods and services. They deal with structural problems, so ongoing issues in the economy, and they help to achieve long-term sustainable growth. The benefit of supply-side policies over demand-side policies is their ability to achieve sustainable growth. So if you've got your supply curve and your demand curve, supply policies shift supply out and therefore lead to stronger growth alongside lower prices, so more sustainable growth moving forward. Okay, so explain the difference. Aggregate demand policies are broad economy-wide policies that focus on the demand side of the economy. They try and stimulate demand by boosting demand for goods and services. They're short-term in nature. They regulate spending. Producers will then respond to increases in spending generally to produce more, unless they're at their productive capacity. Aggregate supply policies, on the other hand, aim to improving living standards by improving supply-side conditions. So reducing capacity constraints, improving the willingness to supply. They have a long-term focus, and they aim to increase the quantity and quality of resources. So they allow for strong and sustainable growth, full employment, and low levels of inflation. And you can provide some examples if you want. Okay, so now we're going to get into the policies, and I'll go through these in more detail in the next video, but we'll get through a couple of them in this video. So first one's policies for research and development. So we're focusing on what we're actually doing, one slide for each, and then the next video I'll talk about the impacts and things to talk about for each of them. So starting with tax concessions, they're offering basically anything from 125 to 175% tax concessions, which allow you to basically claim more than you actually spent on research and development. The idea of that is to increase your expenditure and reduce the amount of tax you have to pay. Okay. The other thing they're doing with research and development is they're restructuring the incentives. So larger companies will get basically companies that are spending a higher proportion of their expenditure is on R&D. So of all the money that they spend on things, if a high percentage of that is on research and development, then they're more likely to get bigger subsidies. But if you just focus on the first one, that's more than enough for you to know. But make sure you explain it clearly, that they allow them to inflate their expenditure, which reduces their profits, which provides that incentive to invest more. Tax policies, so I'm not really going in any particular order here, I'm just choosing a range of them. The main one is the personal income tax plan. So they're giving an immediate tax relief of $1,080 to middle income earners, and up to $2,160 for couples, for people earning less than $126,000. It'll be paid in a lump sum for the next 3 years, and then what they're going to do is the next step, the step in 6 years, which you can also mention, is they're going to get rid of the 32.5% and 37% tax brackets and have one big 30% tax bracket. So you don't have to do all the details. If you're going to be really, make it a little bit more condensed and just say that they're going to remove, for the middle income tax bracket, it'll be reduced to 30%. Even if you can't remember what it's being reduced from, include that as part of your policy, that they will reduce the middle income tax bracket to 30%. Other things is that they've lowered the tax rate to 27.5% for businesses. They did that last year, and this year they've decided they're going to lower it further to 25% by 2021. So it hasn't kicked in yet, but they're going to lower it all the way to 25%. And the instant write-offs, they've increased it from $25,000 to $30,000. Again, this is something people struggled to explain in the last SAC. The idea is that any asset purchases, mention the word purchases, up to $30,000 can now be immediately depreciated, which means that you can claim them in tax and basically reduce your tax expenditure. So there's an incentive to invest in new assets. If you get asked for a policy, there's one in the last SAC about participation. The first one, this one here, is your key one for participation. These two don't really boost participation that much. This first policy is the one you'll be talking about for participation. Welfare reforms, hopefully you watch that other video. It goes for like a minute and it really clearly explains this first one, the job compliance, probably the welfare reform I'd be talking about. So it's basically got mutual obligations, which means that you've got to attend training courses, you've got to attend job interviews. If you don't, then you accrue demerit points. Once you've accrued a certain amount of demerit points, then you'll start on a strike system, and the more strikes you receive, the more of your welfare that gets cut. So first you get demerit points like when you've got your license. The more, if you accrue a certain amount of demerit points, then you can start getting your welfare cut based on the strike system. And that's designed to try and get people to actively seek work by going to interviews, by doing all the training they need to. Making it hard for people on disability support to get payments. You can talk about the changes to those that are on drugs. We'll go onto a cashless card. Parents Next, we didn't really go into, so I won't elaborate on that. Childcare changes. Childcare is a form of welfare reform. So the new childcare package, which is in the last budget, basically makes it sure that those who need it most receive childcare. You need to make sure that you need to be working, studying, or volunteering to receive the refund, the subsidy. So people can't just stay at home and put their kids off to childcare and still receive the subsidy. It has to be you have to be physically working. And the extending the fraud detection, so extending income data matching so that people are making sure they're claiming the right amount of welfare. And that's kind of got the incentive to get back to work because, you might have been overclaiming and getting more money than you should have. And now that they're cracking down on that, you think, well, I might as well get a job because I can't lie about it anymore. So that would be sort of people that were being fraudulent are being targeted. Education policies, there's kind of two main ones. And again, this one's sort of more from a vocational level. So we're talking about training, whereas the second one's more for primary and secondary schools. So from a vocational perspective, they're investing $525 million to equip people with skills. And part of that is the Delivering Skills for Today and Tomorrow package, which includes funding for 80,000 apprenticeships to address areas of skill shortages, training hubs to connect schools and local industries as well. So they're setting up those 10 training hubs as well. The 80,000 new apprenticeships in areas of skill shortages, they're giving subsidies to both apprentices and their employers to try and encourage more people to get apprentices in areas of skill shortages. And secondly, the Gonski was in the last budget, but there was a $24.5 billion quality schools package, which will be over a lot of years, and it's about genuine needs funding. So it's got sort of two components I'll be talking about. One is that there's funding for disadvantaged schools, and two, talk about the STEM initiative. So a lot of money is being put into STEM, designed to boost critical thinking, creativity, those sort of skills as well. Lastly, subsidies. Basically, if you get questioned on subsidies, you don't have to be that specific, but you talk about subsidies to address short-term supply shocks. There's ongoing subsidies to farmers, so you can always talk about subsidies for farmers. There's also the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is turned into the Climate Solution Fund, where people can get subsidies for investing in renewable energy projects through reverse auctions to subsidise renewables. So you have to bid for those subsidies as well. So either of those would be your best subsidies. We'll talk about the rest next because I've run out of time.